At 3:17 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this afternoon, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked out of a secure video conference with President Trump and senior White House officials after 47 minutes of negotiations that were supposed to produce a framework for ending the month-long crisis between the United States and Canada. According to multiple sources who were present on both sides of the call, the negotiations collapsed when Trump demanded that Canada reverse its financial restrictions on U.S. banks, restore guaranteed energy exports, and withdraw from the Alternative Security Partnership Fund before the United States would agree to remove tariffs or reaffirm NORAD commitments. Carney reportedly listened to Trump's demands, paused for several seconds, and then said, "Mr. President, you are asking Canada to surrender. That is not negotiation. Canada will not surrender. This call is over." Carney then disconnected, leaving Trump and his advisors staring at a blank screen. Within 90 minutes, Carney held a press conference in Ottawa announcing that Canada is suspending all negotiations with the United States indefinitely and will proceed with building independent security and economic frameworks, regardless of U.S. objections. This is the moment the last chance for diplomatic resolution of the U.S.-Canada crisis died. And the consequences of Carney walking away from negotiations will reshape North America in ways that cannot be undone. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened in that video conference and what Trump said that caused Carney to end the call. I'm going to reveal the internal White House reaction when Carney disconnected and why officials are describing it as the worst diplomatic failure of Trump's presidency. I'm going to show you what Carney announced in his Ottawa press conference about Canada's path forward without U.S. cooperation. I'm going to explain why this negotiation collapse is different from previous impasses and why it represents a permanent break rather than a temporary setback. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what North America looks like 6 months from now, with no diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and Canada. Subscribe to join the community, leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video if it brought you value. Let me walk you through what happened in that video conference because the details reveal how fundamentally the two sides misunderstood each other's positions. The call was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. after several days of behind-the-scenes diplomatic work. U.S. officials had reached out to Canadian counterparts, suggesting that both sides needed to find an off-ramp from the escalating crisis. Canadian officials agreed to a leaders-level call to explore whether negotiation was possible. The call participants included Trump, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and several senior White House staff on the U.S. side, and Carney, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly, and Defense Minister Blair on the Canadian side. According to sources present, Trump opened the call by saying he was ready to make a deal and that both countries needed to stop this nonsense and get back to normal. Trump then laid out what he characterized as a fair compromise. He said the United States would remove all tariffs on Canadian goods effective immediately. The U.S. would reaffirm commitment to NORAD and joint continental defense. The U.S. would restore full intelligence sharing through Five Eyes, and the U.S. would issue a statement saying it respects Canadian sovereignty and territorial integrity. But in exchange, Trump said Canada had to do 3 things. First, reverse the financial restrictions on U.S. banks that Canada imposed last week and commit to not imposing similar restrictions in the future. Second, sign a 10-year energy export agreement guaranteeing minimum supply levels to the United States at market prices without restriction. Third, withdraw from the Alternative Security Partnership Fund that NATO approved and commit to working exclusively through traditional NATO structures where the U.S. has more influence. Trump said these conditions were reasonable and represented a compromise because the U.S. was offering to give Canada what it wanted while only asking for assurances that Canada would not weaponize economic policy against the United States in the future. According to sources, Carney listened without interrupting. When Trump finished, Carney asked a single question. He said, "Mr. President, are you offering to negotiate these terms or are you presenting them as non-negotiable conditions?" Trump reportedly responded, "These are the terms, take it or leave it. But if you leave it, things are going to get a lot worse for Canada." Carney then spoke for approximately 3 minutes. According to sources who heard his remarks, Carney said, "Mr. President, Canada has spent the last month demonstrating that we can withstand pressure, that we can build alternative partnerships, and that we do not depend on American approval to defend our interests. You are asking us to give up every tool we have developed to protect Canadian sovereignty in exchange for commitments you have already violated multiple times. You want us to trust you after you questioned whether Canadian provinces should remain part of Canada. You want us to lock in energy exports after you threatened our economic security. You want us to abandon security arrangements with allies who supported us when you threatened to dismantle NORAD. None of that is reasonable. That is not compromise. That is surrender. And Canada will not surrender." Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is the immediate reaction on both sides and why the White House is now in absolute chaos. According to sources, when Carney said this call is over and disconnected, there was complete silence in the White House Situation Room for several seconds. Trump reportedly stared at the screen and then said, "He hung up on me." Trump then asked his advisors whether they could reconnect the call. The National Security Advisor explained that Carney had intentionally ended the call and that attempting to reconnect without Canadian consent would be diplomatically inappropriate. Trump reportedly became angry and said, "Call him back. Tell him if he doesn't negotiate, I'm cutting off all trade, all energy, everything." The Secretary of State attempted to explain that the U.S. cannot unilaterally cut off all trade with Canada without congressional approval, and that doing so would devastate the American economy. Trump reportedly responded, "Then what can I do?" The answer, according to sources, was essentially nothing. The U.S. has exhausted its leverage. Canada has built alternatives to American partnership. And Carney has concluded that negotiating with Trump is pointless because Trump views negotiation as the other side accepting his terms, not as mutual compromise. At 4:47 p.m., 90 minutes after the call collapsed, Mark Carney held a press conference in Ottawa. The press conference was brief but definitive. Carney said, "This afternoon I participated in a call with President Trump to explore whether negotiation could resolve the current crisis. I concluded that negotiation is not possible with the current U.S. administration because the United States is not seeking compromise. The United States is seeking Canadian capitulation. Canada will not capitulate." Carney then announced Canada's path forward. He said, "Canada will suspend all negotiations with the United States indefinitely. We will proceed with building independent security capabilities using support from NATO allies through the Alternative Security Partnership Fund. We will diversify our energy export markets and reduce dependence on U.S. buyers. We will strengthen financial regulations to protect Canadian economic stability from external policy volatility. And we will work with partners in Europe, Asia, and across the Commonwealth to build relationships based on mutual respect, not on coercion." Carney closed by saying, "Canada does not seek confrontation. We seek partnership. But partnership requires treating Canada as an equal, not as a subordinate. When the United States is ready to engage on that basis, Canada will be ready to talk. Until then, Canada is moving forward. We will not wait for American permission to defend our interests or to build our future." The press conference lasted less than 6 minutes. Carney took no questions. He delivered his statement and left. The message was clear. Canada is done negotiating. Canada is done waiting. Canada is proceeding independently. Receipt number 1, the market reaction. Within minutes of Carney's press conference, markets reacted to the reality that U.S.-Canada relations are not going to improve anytime soon. The Canadian dollar strengthened another 1.7% against the U.S. dollar as currency traders bet that Canada's independent path will attract investment. U.S. energy stocks fell sharply as traders priced, in the likelihood that Canadian energy exports will be redirected to other markets. Midwest utility stocks dropped as traders recognized that power supply from Canada is now uncertain. The S&P 500 fell 2.3% as investors concluded that the largest U.S. trading relationship is broken with no clear path to repair. Receipt number 2, the European response. Within 2 hours of Carney's announcement, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement expressing support for Canada's position. The statement said, "We understand and respect Canada's decision to suspend negotiations given the lack of good faith engagement from the United States. We stand ready to deepen our partnerships with Canada in defense, trade, and economic cooperation." That's 3 major European powers publicly siding with Canada against the United States and signaling that they will support Canada's independent path. The statement makes clear that if the U.S. and Canada remain in permanent confrontation, Europe will align with Canada. Receipt number 3, the NATO implication. Canada's announcement that it will proceed with building independent security capabilities using support from NATO allies means that the Alternative Security Partnership Fund is now operational, and Canada is the first beneficiary. According to NATO sources, Canada's $8.2 billion funding request will be approved within 72 hours, now that it's clear Canada has no alternative source for these capabilities. The approval will set a precedent that other NATO members can access the fund when they face security threats that traditional structures cannot address, including threats posed by U.S. unreliability. NATO is effectively becoming an alliance that can operate without U.S. leadership, and Canada's decision to move forward independently is accelerating that transformation. Receipt number 4, the energy reality. Canada's commitment to diversify energy export markets and reduce dependence on U.S. buyers is not an empty threat. According to energy industry sources, Canada is in advanced negotiations with China, Japan, South Korea, and Germany on long-term supply agreements. Asian countries are offering premium prices for guaranteed Canadian supply because Canadian energy is more reliable and less geopolitically risky than Middle Eastern alternatives. If Canada signs these agreements, which could happen within weeks, Canadian energy infrastructure will be reconfigured to move oil and gas west to Pacific ports instead of south to the United States. The U.S. will face permanent reduction in Canadian energy imports and will have to source replacement supply from higher-cost, less reliable providers. Here's what happened in Washington in the hours after Carney's press conference. At 5:30 p.m., the National Security Council reconvened for an emergency meeting. According to sources, the mood was described as funereal. Officials discussed whether there was any way to salvage negotiations, but the consensus was that Carney has made a strategic decision to build Canada's future without the United States, and that decision is irreversible while Trump is president. The State Department prepared a memo outlining the long-term consequences of permanent U.S.-Canada estrangement, including loss of intelligence sharing, increased border security costs, economic decoupling that could reduce U.S. GDP by 0.7% annually, and geopolitical isolation as other allies follow Canada's example. The memo concluded that the U.S. faces a choice between capitulating to Canadian demands for equal partnership or accepting permanent loss of America's most important bilateral relationship. At 7:15 p.m., Trump held a meeting with congressional leaders from both parties. According to sources, Trump was told by Republican and Democratic leaders that Congress will not support further escalation against Canada, and that bipartisan majorities want the administration to find a way to restore the relationship. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer reportedly told Trump directly, "You destroyed our relationship with Canada. You need to fix it. And fixing it means accepting that Canada is not going to surrender to you." Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell reportedly said, "Mr. President, you are losing this fight. Canada has alternatives. We don't. You need to change course." Trump reportedly responded that he would not back down and that Canada would eventually realize it needs the United States more than the U.S. needs Canada. Congressional leaders left the meeting convinced that Trump will not change his approach and that the U.S.-Canada relationship will remain broken for the remainder of his term. At 9:01 p.m., the White House issued a statement. The statement said, Canada's decision to walk away from negotiations is disappointing and short-sighted. The United States remains ready to discuss reasonable solutions, but we will not accept demands that undermine American interests or American sovereignty. Canada will discover that isolation has consequences. That statement is weak, defensive, and reveals that the White House has no strategy beyond hoping Canada changes its mind. At 9:45 p.m., the Pentagon issued a separate statement that once again contradicted White House tone. The Pentagon said, "The Department of Defense regrets that diplomatic efforts have not succeeded. We remain committed to North American security and hope that both nations can find a path toward restored cooperation." That's the Pentagon signaling to Canada and to NATO allies that U.S. military leadership does not support Trump's approach and believes the negotiation failure is a strategic disaster. Let me give you 3 scenarios for what North America looks like 6 months from now. Scenario 1, the frozen relationship. The U.S. and Canada maintain minimal contact. Trade continues at reduced levels because companies need cross-border commerce. But government-to-government cooperation is essentially zero. NORAD operates at minimal capacity. Intelligence sharing is suspended. The border becomes heavily monitored and militarized. Both economies suffer, but Canada suffers less because it successfully diversifies energy exports and builds stronger ties with Europe and Asia. The U.S. faces permanent loss of cheap Canadian energy and reliable Canadian partnership. The relationship remains frozen until a new U.S. administration takes office. Scenario 2, the parallel North Americas. Canada formalizes its independent security and economic frameworks. The Alternative Security Partnership Fund becomes Canada's primary defense mechanism. Canadian energy flows predominantly to Asian and European markets. U.S.-Canada trade drops 60% from previous levels. Canada signs formal defense partnerships with UK, France, and Nordic countries. North America effectively splits into 2 separate spheres: a U.S. sphere consisting of the United States and whatever Latin American partners remain willing to work with Washington, and a Canadian sphere consisting of Canada and its European and Commonwealth partners. The continent is divided in ways not seen since before World War II. Scenario 3, the cascade effect. Other U.S. allies, watching Canada successfully decouple from American partnership, begin exploring similar paths. Mexico renegotiates trade relationships to reduce dependence on the U.S. market. Asian allies diversify security partnerships to reduce reliance on U.S. military guarantees. European countries accelerate efforts to build autonomous defense capabilities. Within 2 years, the American-led global order is replaced by multiple regional frameworks that sometimes cooperate with the U.S. and sometimes don't. American global influence declines to levels not seen since before World War II, not because of military defeat, but because allies chose independence over partnership with an unreliable America. I'm watching whether Canada signs any major energy export agreements with non-U.S. buyers in the next 2 weeks, whether NATO formally approves Canada's ASPF funding request within 72 hours as predicted, and whether any other U.S. allies make statements suggesting they're considering similar independent paths. Carney walked away from Trump. That's not a negotiating tactic. That's a strategic decision that Canada can build a better future without the United States than with a United States that demands subordination. The U.S.-Canada partnership is over, and what replaces it will define North America for generations.